Hello and welcome to another episode of the 100 Day Art Challenge. Today I'm doing plein air painting at the beautiful Bodnant Gardens, and I had forgotten all about this recording until the last minute. So this is 1:24 in the morning when I'm recording this audio. I can't believe I forgot all about it. I've spent the day editing a podcast trying to get it ready for Wednesday. So here we are. I start off by getting a very light almost lemon yellow wash, but loads of water, and just before it dries I add some other greeny yellowy greens that are going to bleed in to the background. I'm trying to utilize how wet the surface is to get down some very light colors and getting a wash down of some oranges, browns, greens, blues, and just some bits that can sit in the background as lighter layers for me to build on top of. And that's really how I start to establish my plein air painting with watercolour. And I love this medium to use. I've really gotten to know it quite well over the years, and it's probably the medium I'm most comfortable with, especially for plein air. And I don't do very many of them. I really should. I don't have a good body of work of watercolour, but whenever I've used it, I've felt comfortable with it. I just haven't done it for anything except for sketches, and that's part of what I need to change next year. I think will be the year of me creating a body of work. Hopefully, that's my intention anyway. As you can see here, I'm adding purple, and my thought process is that you can see purple in the shadows and blue in the shadows of a landscape, but it's also just good colour composition because I'm adding a lot of earth tones and a lot of warm colours. Obviously green's a cool colour, but you can add warm greens, and I add a lot of red to my greens. Not a lot of red, but I often add red to my greens, so it's a lot of my greens will have a touch of red in them because I prefer that colour green. Even if it's going to be a cooler green, a touch of red doesn't hurt. It just makes it slightly nicer in my view anyway. So to contrast with that, I add cooler colours like purples and blues, and you can see how much it adds to the landscape immediately. And even though I'm still keeping this really loose with this medium brush I use here, this is the largest brush I brought on the day, and when you use it for a little bit of time with enough pigment and the right amount of water in the bristles, you can draw fairly small lines with it. So I'm trying to do little dashes and marks, suggesting things that are a bit sharper in the foreground as well. Like there's some reeds there on the bottom right hand side, and I'm just trying to enjoy the use of the brush whilst I have some darker pigment where I'm trying to suggest bits of shadow where the light hasn't quite blown out all of the detail, because a lot of this landscape is just beautiful, but it really is just reflecting the heat. And I had this lovely comment from someone here, so have a listen to this. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. That really does put the wind under my sails. That's a beautiful thing to hear from a member of the public, and it doesn't happen very often because normally when people come along and I'm painting, I'm usually at the very messy stage of a painting, and this is still messy, but the colours are light enough and complementary enough to be still quite pretty on the surface. So I think that was a very nice boost that I got on the day, and it does help. But I've got a long way to go, so that's why I'm starting to go darker and darker and suggesting some more solid forms, some more figurative shapes to anchor the viewer into reality. So there's tree trunks and branches, and then just parts of the shadow where I want to build it up, but I want to do it gradually. So I'm adding a still fairly watery but darkish green, because that's going to sit underneath the darker tones again. And I have some bright greens, some which are quite rich and highly saturated. Normally I don't use them, but if they can sit there amongst other colours and then have this really light tone in the distance, it gives this lovely sense of depth. So sometimes I will push the boundaries a little bit with how highly saturated the colour I will use. And for shadow areas I really do like to get some quite rich colours, but you have to be very strategic, and you can see if so long as it's around the edges it will complement the piece. And I always say that if you can make some sort of loose vignette around the edges of your painting, even if it's a sketch, it keeps the viewer's eyes within the painting itself. So you'll notice that all four corners are starting to get suggestions of shadow in the lighter parts are on this diagonal central that goes from the centre up to the right hand corner and from the centre down to the bottom right hand corner. So they're two diagonals that shine throughout the composition, and then you have other diagonal shadows cutting in just for the interest of it. I have a really dark tree there in the centre. Can you see it? That's really is too dark for where it is, because that's in the midground. It's not in the background, but it's too dark for where it sits. It makes it look too prominent, and it's going to catch the eye too much because of how light everything else is around it. It creates this really high contrast. So what I'm going to do here is just take a tissue, and whilst it's still wet, just dab it back. And people say that once you make a decision with watercolour, you're stuck with it, and to an extent that's true, but so long as it's still wet, I encourage you to get a tissue quickly and dab it back. But then, because I have the pigment on the tissue, I try to use that to add a bit of pigment to the other parts of the painting, because it will add random texture that I think can be quite nice. And for all this foliage, it's too much detail. I've done it again there with the green. It's just too big a patch of green, so I've got a tissue, pat it away, and you can see it just takes it away there. And I do want to add that dark green, but just a lot more sparingly and a bit more design. So I just do little blotches and try to just suggest some foliage and some shadow, and then a much more watery light mix for the distance, so that I can add a bit of detail into what I have in the background to suggest the shadow that still captures collects in those leaves. And then just trying to get little suggestions of darker shadow on either side. I'm trying to touch either side relatively equally, even though that's hard to do. But this is what I was left with, and I really enjoy it. And I even made it black and white to see the tonal values, so this is what it looks like in black and white. Thanks for watching the video. I'll see you tomorrow.